Welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast 122. My name is Tom Cagley, and together we will explore the varied worlds of software process improvement and measurement on the SPaMCAST. The cast will cover topics that deal with the challenges of how work is done in information technology organizations as they grow and evolve. The show will combine commentaries, interviews, your feedback to serve up ideas, options, opinions, advice, and even occasional facts. In a nutshell, the cast provides advice for and from practitioners, methodologists, pundits, and consultants. In the Software Process and Measurement Cast 122, I interviewed Ted Theodoropoulos. Ted and I talked about technical debt, broadening the definition, why broadening the definition of technical debt makes the metaphor of technical debt a lot more powerful. This was a fantastic interview. Comments and feedback are welcome. Ted Theodoropoulos, welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, Ted, let's just start down and dirty. So what is technical debt and why do I care?
Well, technical debt is a term that the software development community is very much aware of, coined by Ward Cunningham almost 20 years ago. And it's probably a good exercise to actually go through and look at the different definitions that are out there. Ward's definition of technical debt are those internal things that a development team chooses not to do now, but will impede future development if left undone. And technical debt, according to Ward, doesn't include deferred functionality, except in edge cases where there's some standard being violated. And Ward's definition is probably the most referenced. Gartner has recently proposed a definition, and their definition has centered around the cost of any backlog of maintenance that would be needed to bring corporate applications into a quote-unquote fully supported current release state. And from my perspective, I spent about a decade in operational risk management and IT audit. And the way I see the problem, the short answer is I view technical debt as the opposing force to quality. And that's kind of the short answer. The longer answer is any gap between the technology infrastructure and the operating environment that it supports, which decreases an organization's ability to achieve strategic objectives and has both a principal and measurable interest component. Now, it should be implied that there's a measurable interest component if it's impairing an organization's ability to achieve objectives. But I think it's important to emphasize that because Ward was very careful not to include deferred functionality in his definition. I believe that deferred functionality is technical debt. However, I want to distinguish between a business requesting a dancing sausage on their screen as opposed to requesting an enhancement that actually adds business value. So, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for Ward and his contributions to the development community. It's a community that I've been a part of for many years, so I've directly benefited from his contributions. And from his vantage point, I think his definition makes perfect sense. The issue is that it's purely from a development perspective. And it's understandable why things have progressed this way because the concept has been championed primarily by the development community. But defining things internal to the development process and excluding deferred functionality, really what that does is emphasize some aspects of software quality and de-emphasizing others. And there's a paper by a fellow by the name of David Garvin, who I believe he's with Harvard Business School. He wrote a paper in the 80s talking about different views of quality. And in that paper, he discusses, the fact that quality is obviously multidimensional. I think that the traditional definition that Ward has proposed takes what what David Garvin calls is a manufacturing view, which focuses on the design, the defects, the maintenance, and it really ignores what Garvin calls the user view, which really is about fitness for purpose. So I think there's a gap there that we need to address because, the concept of technical debt has been around for 20 plus, well, almost 20 years, but it's really hasn't gained much traction outside of the development community. And I think in order to make that happen, we really have to capture the value that the metaphor adds. So probably the next most broad definition and most referenced definition is Gartner's. And Gartner's is good because it takes a broader approach, but it's slightly vague. What does fully supported release state really mean? I'm not sure if it literally means there's vendor support provided. What happens if we're one version back? Is that fully supported? What if this fully supported application is suboptimal? In my mind, that represents debt. So that definition seems to overemphasize infrastructure deficiencies. But, I give Gartner credit because really their paper, which estimated IT debt globally at $500 billion, it got a lot of people's attention and it spurred the dialogue. So again, the proposed definition in my mind is an opposing force to quality. And the next logical question would be, okay, well, what is quality? And there's a lot of different models that you could use for that. I think the ISO 9000 quality model does a good job capturing what quality is. It defines quality as all the ilities, so to speak, reliability, usability, maintainability, and part of that, in fact, first on the list is functionality. So excluding deferred functionality impacts the fitness of use or fitness for purpose test, which therefore I think needs to be included. So, from an organizational perspective, if I'm a business owner or a senior exec in the enterprise, I care about all interest payments that's being made on my technology infrastructure, not just those challenges which are specific to development. So if interest is measurable on a deferred piece of functionality, I think it needs to be included, as well as deficiencies in the control environment, the implications of legacy architecture, gaps in user experience, data quality issues, and so on. So I think a broader approach will really move the concept forward.
If we take a broader approach, as you suggest, is there a potential that it becomes too difficult for your average developer or average quality guy or average user to wrap their head around it?
Well, okay, so I think we need to define the term broadly, and then we need some sort of a taxonomy to break this thing down. So I think that, maybe we call what Ward describes as technical debt software debt. Maybe we, create a subset of technical debt that refers to gaps associated with legacy platforms as infrastructure debt. However we do it, I think it can be broken down, and practitioners in those specific spaces, I think, could easily wrap their head around what technical debt means. With respect to the deferred functionality, I think the reason it's so imperative that we include deferred functionality is how technical debt comes about. The concept probably most of your listeners are familiar with is the iron triangle. And, this was a PMBOK concept that has fallen out of favor with that crowd, but it's still a very good illustration of the constraints that projects struggle with, namely time, scope, and budget. So when you were considering alternative approaches, when you have a time, scope, or budget constraint, there's certain things that need to be evaluated. When we're looking at a piece of functionality, we can say, okay, do we implement it the right way, i.e. with no debt? Do we do it quick and dirty, namely incurring technical debt, or do we do it at all? And that would be the equivalent of deferring functionality. And if we don't consider all three of those options, then we don't give decision makers the tools they need to evaluate those alternate approaches. And unfortunately, the technology team has to provide input on not doing it at all, because there's numerous examples of not implementing a piece of functionality that has a material impact on the application itself. So if we decide we're building a CRM system and we decide we don't have time to implement all the functionality required to support every data element in the requirements document. So maybe we decide to skip social security number or the industry that the customer is in. Well, by doing that, we have now accrued, or we will accrue, data quality issues down the road that may become difficult, if not impossible, to address. So again, as a technologist, I need to provide my business partners with the complete picture, i.e., this is the principal, this is the interest, and this is the probability that interest will actually come due on this particular approach.
So you use the term interest. What do you mean by the term interest, Ted?
So we can think of the principal amount of a technical debt as basically the amount of money that would be required to address the particular gap under discussion. The interest is the amount that's being lost either in productivity declines, or interest can represent additional risk that the organization is taking. So, a good example would be if we're using a legacy platform to host one of our applications. This is a very common occurrence in the enterprise. The number of COBOL programmers out there is declining rapidly. At some point, we're going to have operational challenges because it's going to become more and more difficult to find folks who are well-versed in those particular technologies. So the risk component is a tricky piece, but it has to be included in there, because even though we're not paying a tangible interest payment today, the risk that we will tomorrow somehow has to be captured. So interest includes the price we're paying today, as well as some sort of a dollar figure to represent the risk of implications that may come down the road.
So do you think just dollarizing technical debt is the best way to measure it, or are there other avenues that you suggest?
The value of technical debt is its ability to facilitate communications between technology teams, business people. It puts the problem in a paradigm that everybody's familiar with, and we can use our familiarity with debt mechanics, the principal, interest, compounding, those sorts of things to really kind of wrap our heads around what's going on. So, there are different ways to measure technical debt, but I think at the end of the day, putting it in some sort of a financial perspective probably makes the most sense, because it allows decision makers to ultimately make better decisions on where they allocate, their technology resources.
Yeah, I think the dollarization bit actually makes it much more understandable to a broad audience, and you don't have to spend time and effort defining the component parts, especially if there are all sorts of interesting ratios or heat charts.
Yeah, exactly. And there's the metaphor works surprisingly well. I mean, Ward did a great job coining this term and promoting it within the community. It captures the problem surprisingly well, and there's some additional relationships between the problem that it describes in technology and the financial world of debt. You can evaluate your capital structure. So in finance, there's a couple of different ways to finance your business. You can leverage debt capital or equity capital. And the same thing holds true in technology. Doing it right represents equity capital or technical equity, and doing it quick and dirty or not doing it all represents technical debt or debt equity. So evaluating what the appropriate capital structure is for a business, financial capital structure, is very similar to how one would go about examining the appropriate capital structure for their technology environment. So if we think of free cash flow as the amount of resources available to be deployed in technology initiatives, if we have volatility in our free cash flow, then we have a lower risk tolerance than we would have otherwise. Therefore, the amount of debt equity that we leverage in our technology environment needs to be lower than an organization who has more stable free cash flow. So there's a lot of interesting relationships between the technical debt metaphor and financial debt. And we're just really starting to explore those relationships and write about them.
It is interesting, even though the thought process around technical debt is 20 years old, as you mentioned, it really hasn't started to at least germinate and come to its own until relatively recently. You think it was just the Gardner paper that did that?
If you look out there in the blogosphere and see who's writing about this, you'll notice that it's a pretty narrow slice. There's a lot of agile practitioners. You know, there's a strong relationship between your engineering practices and the levels of technical debt in your organization. So, you know, I think that the agile community has dialed into this sooner than most, because the waterfall process, while appropriate for certain projects, by its very nature of not embracing change, creates technical debt. Managing technical debt is managing change. And it hasn't germinated and caught traction in the business community, I think, because of the way it's been defined. And as a business executive, I don't care any more about your technical debt as the development manager than I do the principal and interest that I'm paying by my users not having the features that they need. I don't care. It's the same to me. It's creating a financial impact, and it's also impairing my ability to meet my objectives. So until we get things on a level playing field, I don't think it's going to really appeal to the broader business audience, which is why I'm proposing we broaden the scope a bit.
So with a broader scope, can an organization actually create a strategy to address technical debt, or is there some basic level of technical debt that they have to live with?
So that's a great question. And, you know, technical debt, the best analogy I can propose is, you know, a person's body fat percentage. So you're always going to have body fat, and a certain amount of body fat is actually healthy. If you get to levels that are too low, there begins to be health implications. The same holds true with technical debt. This is another challenge. There's so many divergent definitions of what technical debt is. It's really fragmented the dialogue. And, you know, I've seen several, you know, papers out there and blog entries that strive for 100% elimination of technical debt. And that's not realistic, and it's not healthy. There's a certain amount of debt that is always going to exist just because it's inherent in what we do, and a certain amount that's healthy. And, you know, if we get to a point where there's no technical debt, we're going to ultimately hamstring and constrain our ability to innovate and take new risks. And that's not good. So it's very difficult to say what the right percentage is for an organization. But, you know, I would, in trying to find out what that magic number is for your organization, I would look very closely at your risk tolerance. And, you know, for a mission critical system that's running all of your operations and has highly sensitive data that is subject to regulatory scrutiny, I would say that you have a pretty low tolerance for technical debt with respect to that application. However, if you're building the new Twitter and you need to get this solution out the door to be the first to market to seize that opportunity, I would say you need to take some risks, and a higher percentage of technical debt is not only acceptable, it's necessary.
In organizations where, if we're assuming that some degree of technical debt is proper, and I understand that it makes sense from the point of view of innovation and risk-taking, what's the avenue for governing this? I mean, it can't be just laissez-faire and we'll take a look at it every other year kind of a scenario.
Right. So, yeah, as I mentioned, take even a step back further from my previous comments and on risk tolerance, and understand why you should govern technical debt. There's a story that I outline in one of my blog entries on technical debt governance. It's a study that MIT did in 2004 on the relationship between effective IT governance and corporate profitability. The conclusion was pretty dramatic. MIT concluded that organizations with effective IT governance enjoy 20% higher profits compared to those pursuing similar strategies that have less effective IT governance. So, it's not hard to make a case as to why you should, but people need to understand that. So, profitability is a big reason why. And, another reason why is just general prudent risk management. I'm a big fan of Stephen Covey, and in the 7 Habits, he talks about maintaining the PC balance. And I think that's an important analogy, because he uses the metaphor of sharpening your saw, so to speak. And PC balance is productivity and production capabilities. So, if we don't sharpen our saw while we have some downtime, when the wood gets here, we may not be able to cut it. So between the profitability and the risk management, importance, I think you can make a good case as to why. Understanding how is a big challenge, because, it's not as simple as writing a policy on technical debt. CIO gets his execs together, sits in a boardroom and irons out a policy on how we're going to manage this thing. Without the proper culture, I think that policies have very limited effectiveness, and mostly because policies tend to focus on, punitive incentives. So, there was an interesting study in the book Freakonomics, which I'm a big fan of, and it really kind of gets into people's minds and evaluates what drives behaviors. And they talk about a daycare study of, I think it was about a dozen daycare centers that were having issues with parents picking their kids up late. And so the economists got wind of this somehow and decided to do a little experiment. And what they did is they wanted to see how a punitive measure would affect the problem that they were having with tardy parents. So they added a fee of several $100s to their bill on a monthly basis when they would be late to pick their kids up. So guess what happened after they implemented this policy?
They were later.
Yeah, late pickups doubled in just a matter of weeks. And, evaluating kind of why that might have happened, there's a lot of different conclusions that you could draw, but you could make a good argument that, parents felt like it was okay if they paid the fine, whereas, maybe they felt some moral obligation, or some there would be some social implications to showing up late. But hey, if I know it's okay if I just pay a fee, maybe I do that. So, the 3 types of incentives that are out there are economic, social, and moral. Economic is the least effective focus in governance programs. So we need to kind of turn that on its head a little bit and create the appropriate culture where the guy sitting next to you who sees you taking a shortcut in your development process and not documenting it or going through the appropriate process to manage, that's going to carry much more weight than any sort of policy that says, we're going to take you out and shoot you if you accrue technical debt and don't let us know about it.
Yeah, the thou shalt not accrue technical debt without putting it down on the technical debt ledger, I'm not 100% convinced will ever work.
Yeah, and it's, again, it's if people understand why and their right behaviors are rewarded in an organization, I think that it could work. Now, if people don't understand why and there's no incentive other than avoiding a negative outcome, no, it won't work, because there's other forces that are imposed on the individual in an organization that have a much stronger influence. And I think another key thing to take away from, looking at the whole governance approach is back to that PPC balance. If you have a culture where your folks are working 70 hours a week, trying to get things out the door, risk management is not going to be at the top of their list. So maintaining that PPC balance, you can't do it in one area of the business, i.e., in your technology, but then neglect it with respect to your people. That work-life balance needs to be respected. And I think, in the technology world, that's something that's been a challenge. Anybody who's worked in enterprises knows that when there's a drop dead date and high visibility, it's do or die. And those things are going to happen occasionally, but that can't be the norm. So culture is a key component of effectively governing technical debt.
I agree, and I think it's broader than just technical debt. I think the whole discussion of governance, it becomes more of a behavioral science than it does necessarily a purely accounting science.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we've got, it's amazing how short our memories are sometimes, because, after the 2001 crash, the dot-com boom, whatever you want to call it, where we had MCI, Enron, these huge corporate scandals, what was the reaction? Oh, we need more legislation. So they threw together Sarbanes-Oxley. And, this was, anybody who's worked in risk management in the enterprise knows what a huge burden SOX compliance is. But, look what happened just a few years later. We've got the Bear Stearns of the world and, BP. We've got all these, and BP wasn't related to SOX specifically, but SOX was supposed to address, these risks, especially in the financial space with these companies, to address these financial statement gaps. And we just had the biggest financial crisis since the Great Depression, even after something as comprehensive as SOX was put in place to prevent it. And where we fell down was addressing culture. The investment banking mentality to ignore the risk side of the risk-reward equation was a much stronger influence on decision makers in those organizations than was, this piece of legislation that we had out there called Sarbanes-Oxley. So, governance is a tricky thing. And, if we think that a piece of paper is going to solve the problem, I think it's going to be, a tough challenge.
Definitely agree. Ted, if you woke up tomorrow morning and had the power to address any two issues in the technical debt world, what would those issues be and why?
Well, any two issues. So I alluded to one in the beginning of our conversation with broadening the perspective. I think technical debt is a wonderful metaphor, and I would really like to see it move forward. I think it has important applications in business and technology. in order to do that, I think we need to measure quality and debt's implications to quality from an organizational perspective. So fitness of purpose has to be part of the definition of quality. There's just no two ways about that in my mind. We need to ask ourselves, is it a good solution, and does it address the right problem? If we just look at, is it a good solution, I think that technical debt is going to be limited in where it gains traction. Another thing that I would change if I had my choice, and this is probably a bit more challenging, is establishing some sort of a leadership role, or maybe having some sort of a standards organization adopt the concept to kind of drive or centralize the forces that are driving the evolution of the concept. I think we have numerous divergent definitions today of what technical debt is. One of the most, I think, visible differences of opinion in the technical debt space is with respect to what they call CRUFT. And CRUFT is a kind of a slang term for sloppy code. A lot of folks out there, very well-respected folks, say that CRUFT is not technical debt. And I wholly disagree. I think that...
What would it be?
Anything...
What would it be if it wasn't technical debt?
Well, yeah, and I think the argument is that there was no explicit borrowing that took place. In other words, you just kind of hired some folks that didn't know what they were doing, and they wrote some sloppy code. There's a blog posting out there by a fellow by the name of Uncle Bob Martin, and he says, a mess isn't technical debt, it's just a mess.
Okay.
And, it's the fact of the matter is, a CRUFT is non-strategic technical debt. It still has to be paid back. It still has interest. So I'd love to see us come to some agreement on that, as well as the other differences, like where infrastructure falls into play, because all this is really translated into a fragmented view of the topic. And I think establishing some sort of leadership would go a long way in moving things forward.
Fantastic. Ted, if people wanted to continue the conversation with you, how could they get in touch with you? Where can they find your blog? Additional
dialogue, I think, is key with this. We have a blog with my firm. It's blog.acrowire.com. We put a lot of focus and emphasis on technical debt because it's something that is top of mind as we're developing new solutions. And I'd encourage people to come out and share their thoughts and challenge some ideas that I've proposed and get involved. I think that would only result in a positive outcome.
Yeah, I think it would be excellent to see a little debate. Just taking a very parochial view, making it just software debt, I think actually limits it. So I'd actually like to see an interesting discussion of that go on. Ted, thank you for participating. As you well know, I open up the platform here at the end of the interview to let my interviewee promote anything they like. So, Ted, the platform's yours.
Thanks, Tom. I think that you hit just in that last little bit of dialogue what it is that I'd like to promote. And I'd like to promote additional discussion on the topic. Just recently, sometime late last summer, there was a Software Engineering Institute workshop on technical debt. There's another workshop coming up in May. There's a call for papers right now on technical debt. I'm actually in the process of putting one together. Unfortunately, the date is this Friday for submission, so I think we've kind of lost any opportunity for this particular workshop. But I would encourage dialogue. I would love for folks to visit my blog and share their thoughts on this perspective. And I would also love to hear, from folks much more visible in the development community and hear their take on this proposal, such as Israel Gatt, which was a guest on your show in December. I'd love to hear what Ward thinks about the ideas of broadening the scope, because ultimately there may be some challenges that I have not considered. I've given this a lot of thought and bounced this off a lot of folks, and it's not an idea that came about yesterday. It's some that's developed over many years. But I think ultimately for this idea to gain traction, we're going to need folks like Martin Fowler and Ward Cunningham and Israel Gatt, Kent Beck, folks with a lot more juice than me to really grab a hold of this and continue that dialogue and maybe make some positive changes in how we look at the problem.
Well, I think you've certainly laid the gauntlet down, and perhaps we can get a sort of a roundtable discussion going. But nevertheless, in the future, interested in coming back and talking about the topic again?
Absolutely. I could talk all day on the topic.
Super. Again, Ted, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom.
The Software Process and Measurement Cast 123 will feature an excerpt from the Metrics Minute. We will be tackling burn down charts. And I really mean it this time. The SPaMCAST blog and show notes can be found at www.spamcast.net. Contact SPaMCAST at spamcastinfo@gmail.com. Voice messages can be left at 1-206-888-6111. I also Twitter, and my Twitter ID is T Cagley, so please track me down. It's my intent to share all voice messages, emails, Twitters. Your comments, questions, rants are appreciated and will help to facilitate a dialogue and build community. Let me know the topics that you would like to have covered and the people you'd like to get interviewed. Get involved. The music on SPaMCAST is made available by the PodSafe Music Network at www.podshow.com. The featured song is by 2012 and is titled Last Battle. Information on the band can be found at www.myspace.com/2012vision.com. 2012 does an incredible job with experimental electronica. Be sure to support 2012 and all PodSafe artists. SPaMCAST is released under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 3.0 license. If process improvement is a never-ending journey, why do so many people ask, when will we arrive? See you next week.